What if I told you that the most advanced military on the planet was left absolutely speechless by a group of soldiers who refused to take showers? Picture this. Bagram Airbase, Afghanistan, 2002. An American lieutenant steps out of his air-conditioned command tent, expecting to greet elite Special Forces operators. Instead, what walks off that Chinook helicopter looks more like a band of wandering bushmen than professional soldiers. Filthy uniforms, unkempt beards, gear held together with duct tape. The American officer literally asks his sergeant if they just picked up local fighters by mistake. But here is where it gets absolutely wild. Those scruffy, unwashed men were about to teach the entire coalition force a lesson they would never forget. They were the New Zealand SAS, and what they did next terrified seasoned American troops, baffled intelligence analysts, and completely shattered everything the West thought it knew about modern warfare. We are talking about soldiers who disappeared into the mountains for 3 weeks at a time without resupply. Operators who tracked high-value targets using broken twigs and disturbed pebbles, while million-dollar drones circled uselessly overhead. Men who voluntarily laid in sewage-filled irrigation ditches for days, waiting to strike. Warriors who climbed to altitudes that put American Rangers in the hospital, carrying 80 kilograms on their backs, then calmly brewed tea at the summit. This is not Hollywood fiction. This is documented military history that coalition commanders tried to understand and failed. Why did the Kiwis refuse basic hygiene on operations? What ancient tracking skills did they use that satellites could not replicate? How did men in their 40s outperform younger troops equipped with cutting-edge technology? And what happened during that 23-day observation post mission that left American Special Operations personnel absolutely stunned? Stay with me, because what you are about to discover will completely change how you understand modern special forces. This is the untold story of primitive tactics that dominated the most technologically advanced battlefield in history. And trust me, by the end of this video, you will never look at duct tape the same way again. The American lieutenant stepped out of his air-conditioned command tent at Bagram Airbase in late 2002, clutching a steaming cup of coffee. He had been briefed about the New Zealand SAS team arriving that morning. When the Chinook landed and the ramp dropped, he nearly spat out his drink. What shuffled down that ramp looked nothing like the crisp Special Operations soldiers he expected. These men were filthy. Their beards were unkempt, their uniforms non-standard, and their boots looked like they had been dragged through hell and back. One operator wore a local pecole hat. Another had what appeared to be duct tape, holding together a piece of gear. The lieutenant leaned toward his sergeant and muttered a question about whether they had just picked up local fighters by mistake. The sergeant, a veteran of the First Gulf War, shook his head slowly and replied with a grim smile that those were the Kiwis, and they were about to teach everyone how real war worked. That first impression would become legendary across coalition bases in Afghanistan, while American forces rolled out with millions of dollars worth of night vision, thermal imaging drones, and satellite-linked communication systems. The New Zealand SAS showed up looking like they had just walked out of a bush survival course. But appearances deceived. Within weeks, those same scruffy operators would accomplish missions that left their high-tech allies stunned and scrambling to understand how men who refused to shower could outperform reconnaissance systems that cost more than entire villages. The culture shock ran deep. American soldiers stationed at forward operating bases lived by strict hygiene protocols. Showers every 48 hours minimum, clean uniforms, regulation grooming standards. The Kiwis ignored all of it. They would disappear into the Hindu Kush mountains for 2, sometimes 3 weeks at a stretch, carrying everything on their backs. No resupply choppers, no creature comforts, just bullets, water purification tablets, and dried rations that tasted like cardboard. When they returned to base, they stank so badly that American personnel would literally step back when they walked past. Coalition officers complained to their New Zealand counterparts about the lack of military bearing. The Kiwi commanders just shrugged and pointed at the mission success rate. But this was merely the opening act of a much larger revelation about the nature of modern warfare. The Intelligence Fusion Center at Kandahar hummed with activity in early 2003. Banks of computer screens displayed real-time feeds from Predator drones circling above the Helmand River Valley. Analysts pored over intercepted radio chatter and thermal imaging scans. A high-value target, a senior Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks across 3 provinces, had been tracked to a complex cave network in the mountains near the Pakistan border. American special operations teams had been hunting him for 6 weeks. Drones watched the area 24/7. Signals intelligence picked up fragments of communications. Yet every raid came up empty. The target vanished like smoke whenever coalition forces moved in. The operations officer, a West Point graduate with 2 combat tours under his belt, stared at the screens in frustration. He had thrown every technological advantage at this problem. Satellites tracked movements. Thermal cameras penetrated darkness. Electronic warfare systems jammed enemy communications. Nothing worked. The target was always one step ahead, melting into terrain that swallowed soldiers whole. Then a quiet voice spoke up from the back of the room. A New Zealand SAS sergeant, attached as a liaison, suggested they try something different. Forget the drones for a day. Let his team go in on foot and track the target the old-fashioned way. The American officer almost laughed. Track him how exactly? By following footprints like some kind of frontier scout? This was modern warfare, not a cowboy movie. The Kiwi sergeant did not argue. He simply noted that thermal imaging could not see through cave roofs, and drones could not smell the difference between a week-old campfire and one that died an hour ago. The room fell silent. The operations officer, desperate and out of options, authorized the attempt. 48 hours, he said. If the Kiwis found nothing, they would return to conventional methods. What happened next became the stuff of coalition legend and would reshape how certain units approached tracking operations across Afghanistan. The NZSAS team inserted before dawn on a ridge 3 kilometers from the last known position of the target. No helicopters this time. They had climbed for 9 hours through vertical terrain that would have broken regular infantry. Each man carried between 60 and 80 kilograms of gear. No fancy exoskeletons, no powered assistance, just muscle, bone, and the kind of mental toughness forged in the unforgiving mountains and forests of New Zealand. The team leader, a Maori veteran whose grandfather had fought in Malaya, knelt beside a dried-up stream bed and studied the ground. His fingers traced patterns in the dust that would have looked like random disturbance to anyone else. He pointed to a cluster of stones that had been moved recently. The positioning was wrong, too deliberate. Someone had stepped there within the last 12 hours. The team moved like ghosts. They did not speak, hand signals only. Every 50 meters they stopped and read the terrain. A broken branch here, disturbed leaves there, the faint impression of a boot heel in soft earth near a water source. American doctrine relied on technology to paint a picture of the battlefield. The Kiwis used their eyes, their noses, and skills passed down through generations of soldiers who had hunted enemies in jungles from Borneo to Vietnam. By midday, they had found a trail that no satellite image had detected, a narrow goat path that wound up into a canyon system completely invisible from the air. The temperature dropped as they climbed higher. At 3,000 meters elevation, the air thinned enough to make every breath a conscious effort. The younger American liaison officer attached to the team started to struggle. His pack, loaded with encrypted radio gear and backup batteries for thermal sights, weighed him down. He gasped for oxygen while the Kiwi operators, some of them well into their 40s, moved with steady mechanical efficiency. One of them, a grizzled sergeant with more than 20 years in the regiment, glanced back and offered a thermos of tea he had brewed that morning on a tiny gas stove. The American took it gratefully, too exhausted to question why these men carried tea-making supplies into combat. They reached the mouth of the cave system just before sunset. The entrance was concealed behind a rockfall that looked completely natural. The Kiwi tracker knelt again and examined the ground. Fresh scuff marks on the stone. The faint smell of wood smoke trapped in the rocks. He estimated the target had passed through within the last 6 hours. The team settled into positions around the entrance and waited. No radio chatter, no thermal scopes sweeping the darkness. Just eyeballs and patience. 16 hours later, just after dawn, the target emerged. He was flanked by 2 bodyguards and heading down the mountain toward what he assumed was safety. The NZSAS team took them without firing a shot. Suppressed weapons, close-range precision, and movements so quick that the bodyguards barely had time to register what was happening. The high-value target was zip-tied, hooded, and on his way to a detention facility, before the drones overhead even repositioned to get a clear view of the site. The intelligence haul from the cave was massive. Maps, documents, communications equipment. All of it had been sitting there invisible to satellites and thermal cameras, waiting for someone willing to get their boots dirty. When the team returned to base, the operations officer stood speechless. He had watched the drone feed show absolutely nothing for 2 days. Then suddenly the Kiwis appeared on camera with a captured target in tow. He demanded to know how they had done it. The answer was simple and humiliating in equal measure. They walked, looked at the ground, and used their brains. No million-dollar sensor suite required. Just skills that had been considered obsolete in the age of high-tech warfare. But the real test of the NZSAS primitive effectiveness was yet to come, in the unforgiving peaks, where altitude became a weapon and endurance determined survival. The Tora Bora region in late 2001 presented coalition forces with a nightmare scenario. Al-Qaeda fighters had retreated into a cave complex so vast and so high in the mountains that conventional assaults became exercises in futility. American bombers dropped ordnance that shook the earth, but the enemy simply waited out the bombardment deep underground and emerged when the aircraft left. Ground forces tried to advance, but the altitude and terrain defeated them. Soldiers trained at sea level found themselves collapsing from altitude sickness at 3,500 meters. Equipment malfunctioned in the extreme cold. Helicopters struggled to maintain lift in the thin air. The NZSAS team assigned to the sector took a different approach. They did not wait for helicopter insertion. They walked. For 3 days they climbed, carrying loads that would have hospitalized less conditioned troops. At night the temperature plunged to minus 20 degrees Celsius. During the day the sun reflected off snow and ice with blinding intensity. The American Special Operations personnel watching from lower elevations assumed the Kiwis would turn back. No sane commander would push soldiers that hard without mechanized support. But the New Zealanders were not operating on American assumptions. They were drawing on a heritage of hardship that stretched back to the Pacific campaigns of World War II, where their fathers and grandfathers had learned that complaining changed nothing, and the only way out was through. By the 4th day, they had established an observation post on a ridge that coalition intelligence had deemed inaccessible on foot. From that position, they had a clear line of sight into the valley where Al-Qaeda forces were moving supplies. The Kiwi team leader, a soft-spoken man who had grown up on a South Island sheep station, set up a spotting scope and began calling in coordinates for airstrikes. The precision was devastating. Supply convoys that had been untouchable for weeks were obliterated. Enemy fighters, trying to flee through what they thought were safe routes, found themselves under accurate sniper fire from angles they had not believed possible. American officers monitoring the operation from Bagram asked repeatedly how the Kiwis had reached that position. The answer was always the same. They walked. No secret technique, no advanced technology, just the willingness to suffer longer and harder than the enemy. The concept was alien to a military culture built on technological supremacy and force multiplication. The idea that you could simply outwork the problem through sheer physical endurance seemed almost insulting to the billions spent on equipment and training. Yet there it was, proven in blood and results. The mountains did not care about your budget. They respected only strength and stubbornness. The phrase began circulating through coalition bases like wildfire. The Kiwis are built different. Soldiers swapped stories about New Zealand operators who seemed immune to exhaustion, cold, and discomfort. One American ranger recalled seeing an NZSAS team return from a 3-week patrol in the snow-covered peaks. They walked into base, dropped their packs, and immediately asked when the next mission was scheduled. No medical checks, no downtime requests, just a quick resupply and they were ready to go back out. The ranger admitted he felt soft by comparison, despite being part of an elite light infantry unit himself. But endurance was only half the story. What truly set the NZSAS apart was their willingness to embrace discomfort as a tactical advantage rather than an obstacle to overcome. The green zone south of Kandahar in 2006 was a patchwork of irrigation ditches, dense vegetation, and mud-walled compounds that created a defender's paradise. Taliban fighters used the terrain to launch hit-and-run attacks, then disappear into the maze of fields and canals. Coalition forces tried to root them out with armored vehicles and air support, but the environment negated those advantages. Tanks bogged down in the soft earth. Helicopters had limited visibility through the thick foliage. Infantry patrols moved slowly, vulnerable to ambushes at every turn. The NZSAS took one look at the green zone and decided that the only way to win there was to become part of the landscape. They abandoned their vehicles and waded into the irrigation canals. The water was filthy, contaminated with agricultural runoff and human waste. Disease was a given. Skin infections, dysentery, parasites. The Kiwis accepted it as the price of effectiveness. They would lie for hours in those fetid ditches, submerged up to their necks, waiting for Taliban fighters to pass within meters of their position. Then, they would strike with shocking violence, emerging from the muck like creatures from a nightmare. American troops operating in adjacent sectors heard the stories and struggled to believe them. Special operations soldiers voluntarily lying in sewage for an entire day. It sounded like exaggeration. Then the reports started coming in. Taliban fighters found dead in fields with no indication of how they had been killed. Weapons caches discovered in compounds that had been searched multiple times before. The NZSAS were winning by refusing to play by the rules that coalition forces took for granted. They did not need clean operating conditions. They did not require regular resupply. They certainly did not care about maintaining a professional appearance. They cared about killing the enemy and protecting their brothers. Everything else was negotiable. The psychological impact on coalition troops was significant. Junior officers who had been taught that modern soldiers required certain standards of living to maintain effectiveness watched the Kiwis demolish those assumptions. One Marine Corps captain admitted in a debriefing that seeing NZSAS operators work changed his entire understanding of what humans were capable of enduring. These were not superhuman athletes. Many of them were older, grizzled veterans with bad knees and decades of wear on their bodies. What they had was a culture that valorized toughness and scorned excuses. The famous New Zealand No. 8 wire mentality, the ability to improvise and make do with whatever was available, translated directly into combat effectiveness. An incident in 2007 illustrated the point perfectly. An NZSAS patrol vehicle broke down deep in hostile territory. American doctrine would have called for immediate extraction or at minimum a recovery vehicle to tow the disabled asset. The Kiwis pulled out duct tape, wire, and a toolkit that looked like it belonged in a rural garage. Within 90 minutes, they had the vehicle running again, using parts cannibalized from less critical systems and field repairs that would have horrified a military mechanic. They completed their mission and drove the jerry-rigged vehicle back to base, where it promptly fell apart in the motor pool. The American liaison officer watching the whole episode just shook his head and muttered that the Kiwis could probably fight a war with nothing but sheep wire and determination. But the primitive tactics came with a darker edge, one that revealed itself in close-quarters battle, where split-second decisions meant life or death. The Intercontinental Hotel in Kabul became a war zone on the night of June 28, 2011. Taliban fighters armed with suicide vests, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades stormed the building and began massacring guests. The assault was coordinated and brutal. Afghan security forces engaged the attackers but struggled to make headway against entrenched fighters who had fortified positions inside the hotel. Coalition forces staged nearby, waiting for clearance and developing a tactical plan. The situation was complex. Hostages were involved. The building layout was unclear. Standard protocols called for careful deliberation before committing troops. The NZSAS team on Quick Reaction Force duty that night did not wait for protocols. They mounted their vehicles and drove straight toward the sound of gunfire. Among them was Corporal Willie Apiata, the first New Zealander to receive the Victoria Cross in over 50 years, for his actions in Afghanistan 4 years earlier. Apiata and his teammates had built their reputation on aggression and initiative. When they arrived at the hotel, Afghan forces were still trying to establish a perimeter. The Kiwis listened to the radio chatter for about 30 seconds, assessed the situation, and made a decision. They were going in. The entry was violent and fast. No prolonged reconnaissance. No waiting for perfect intelligence. The NZSAS breached doors, cleared rooms, and moved through the building with a speed that shocked the Afghan commandos working alongside them. This was the other side of the primitive effectiveness coin. The same willingness to endure discomfort and hardship, translated into an almost reckless courage under fire. The Kiwis did not calculate odds or worry about backup plans. They saw teammates in danger, and they reacted with an aggression that bordered on feral. American Special Operations observers monitoring the situation from a tactical operations center watched in real time as the NZSAS carved through the hotel. One of them later described it as watching a bulldozer in human form. There was no finesse, no high-tech gadgetry, just hard men with rifles moving forward until the threat was eliminated. The contrast with American tactics, which emphasized overwhelming firepower and detailed planning, could not have been starker. Both approaches worked, but the Kiwi method was undeniably more primitive. It relied on the individual warrior's willingness to charge into hell because his brothers needed him. The hotel was secured in less than 3 hours. Taliban fighters were eliminated. Hostages were rescued. The NZSAS team regrouped, checked for casualties, and prepared to move out. When American liaison officers arrived to debrief them, they found the Kiwis already cleaning weapons and reloading magazines for the next call. There was no celebration, no chest thumping, just quiet professionalism and the unspoken understanding that this was the job. The Americans asked how they had moved through the building so quickly without detailed floor plans or intelligence. The answer was simple: they relied on instinct, training, and the knowledge that hesitation killed people. This mentality traced directly back to the warrior culture embedded in New Zealand society, particularly among the Maori population that made up a significant portion of NZSAS ranks. The concept of whanau, or family, extended to the regiment. Your teammates were not just colleagues. They were brothers in the deepest sense. You did not leave them. You did not fail them. If saving them meant running through machine gun fire, you ran. If it meant carrying a wounded man across open ground while enemy rounds cracked past your head, you carried. Willie Apiata had demonstrated this exact principle in 2004 when he carried a critically wounded comrade to safety under sustained Taliban fire. That action earned him the Victoria Cross. More importantly, it crystallized the ethos that defined the NZSAS approach to warfare. American military culture valued heroism, but it also emphasized calculated risk and force preservation. The NZSAS seemed to operate on a different frequency entirely, one where personal safety was subordinate to mission success and brotherhood. This was not recklessness. It was a different calculus of acceptable risk. The Kiwis trained harder, accepted worse conditions, and pushed themselves further precisely so they could afford to be more aggressive when it mattered. The primitive tactics were not a bug. They were a feature. But perhaps nowhere was the effectiveness of the Kiwi approach more evident than in the realm of reconnaissance and surveillance, where patience became a weapon and stillness meant survival. The Uruzgan province in 2008 was a Taliban stronghold. Coalition intelligence indicated that a major weapons smuggling route ran through a remote valley, but confirming it required boots on the ground. American forces had tried observation posts before. They lasted 48 to 72 hours before enemy patrols forced them to withdraw or reinforcements had to fight their way in. The NZSAS volunteered to establish a long-term OP overlooking the valley. Coalition commanders approved, expecting a similar timeline. The Kiwis had other plans. They inserted at night, moving on foot across terrain that guaranteed no vehicle support would be available. The observation post was a shallow scrape in the rocks on a ridgeline that offered commanding views of the valley below. 2 men occupied the position at a time, rotating every 8 hours from a hide site 30 meters away. The conditions were inhuman. Daytime temperatures exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. At night, they dropped near freezing. There was no shelter, no resupply. The team had carried enough food and water for 10 days, assuming that would be the maximum duration before extraction. They stayed for 23 days. The feat was almost incomprehensible to American Special Operations Forces monitoring the mission. 3 weeks without resupply in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The Kiwis rationed water so strictly that each man was consuming less than 1 liter per day in desert heat. They ate sparingly, stretching freeze-dried rations that were meant to last a week into nearly a month. Hygiene was non-existent. They urinated into bottles and defecated into bags that were buried at night, to avoid leaving any trace of their presence. The smell inside the hide site became so overpowering that the men rotated positions, not for tactical reasons, but simply to escape the stench for a few hours. But the intelligence they gathered was gold. They observed weapons convoys moving through the valley, documented patterns of activity, identified key facilitators, and provided targeting data that led to a series of highly successful raids. The information could not have been obtained any other way. Drones were useless in the narrow valley where terrain masked movement. Local informants were unreliable and often compromised. Only direct observation by trained operators could provide the fidelity of intelligence needed for effective operations. When the team finally extracted, then they had lost an average of 8 kilograms each. Dehydration, malnutrition, and exposure had taken a severe toll. Medical personnel who examined them were horrified by their condition. One doctor asked why they had not called for early extraction when supplies ran low. The team leader, his lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration, explained that they still had mission capability and the intelligence was too valuable to abandon. The doctor stared at him in disbelief. These men had pushed themselves to the edge of physiological collapse because the job was not finished. It was the Kiwi way. You did not quit because it hurt. You quit when you were dead, or the mission was complete. Stories like this spread through the special operations community and created an almost mythical reputation for the NZSAS. They became known as the unit you called when conditions were so terrible that no one else would accept the mission. Need someone to sit on a freezing mountain for a month? Call the Kiwis. Need a team to wade through sewage-filled canals hunting insurgents? The New Zealanders would do it without complaint. American operators began using NZSAS as a verb. If a mission required extreme endurance and minimal support, you NZSAS'd it. The term was equal parts respect and awe. The primitive effectiveness doctrine had one more dimension that coalition forces struggled to replicate, and it centered on the Kiwi relationship with the environment itself. The mountains of northeastern Afghanistan in 2009 became a hunting ground for a new kind of warfare. Taliban and Al-Qaeda remnants had learned to avoid electronic signatures. They traveled without radios, used couriers instead of phones, and moved at night to evade thermal imaging. American forces responded by increasing drone coverage and deploying more sophisticated sensors. The enemy adapted again, moving deeper into terrain where technology struggled. It became a stalemate. The NZSAS approached the problem from a completely different angle. They stopped trying to see the enemy with machines and started reading the land like their ancestors had read the New Zealand bush. The skills came from an older tradition. Many Kiwi operators had grown up hunting in the rugged mountains and forests of the South Island. They understood how animals moved through terrain, how weather affected tracks, how time and temperature changed sign. Those same skills applied to hunting humans. A patrol would spend hours examining a single square meter of ground. They could tell from the depth of a footprint how heavily loaded the person was. The direction of displaced pebbles indicated which way they were traveling. The age of disturbed earth revealed when they had passed. Broken vegetation showed whether movement was hurried or cautious. It was tracking reduced to a science, but a science that no machine could replicate because it required intuition, built through thousands of hours in the field. American Special Operations soldiers attached to NZSAS patrols witnessed this firsthand and struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. One Green Beret described watching a Kiwi sergeant kneel beside what looked like undisturbed ground and announced that 4 men carrying heavy loads had passed through heading northwest, approximately 6 hours earlier. The American asked how he could possibly know that. The sergeant pointed to nearly invisible scuff marks on rocks, a pattern of compressed grass, and the faint outline of a boot heel in dust. To the untrained eye, it was nothing. To someone who had spent 30 years reading the bush, it was a billboard. This skill set led to mission successes that baffled coalition intelligence analysts. Targets that had evaded capture for months were located and neutralized by NZSAS teams using nothing but visual tracking. Weapons caches buried in remote areas were discovered because the Kiwis noticed inconsistencies in how the earth lay. Safe houses hidden in villages were identified because operators observed subtle changes in foot traffic patterns around certain buildings. It was detective work at the most fundamental level, and it was devastatingly effective. The primitive tactics reached their apex when combined with modern weaponry. An NZSAS sniper team in 2010 tracked a Taliban commander for 3 days through the mountains using traditional fieldcraft. When they finally had a shot, the operator used a rifle worth $20,000 with optics that cost another $10,000. The contrast was perfect. Stone Age tracking methods meeting 21st century precision. The bullet flew true across 900 meters, and the target dropped. The team melted back into the mountains before anyone even realized what had happened. Coalition commanders began requesting NZSAS teams specifically for tracking operations. The Kiwis became the go-to solution when high-value targets went to ground in remote areas. Their success rate was significantly higher than units relying primarily on technology because they were playing a different game entirely. While American forces tried to find the enemy using satellites and sensors, the New Zealanders simply followed the footprints. The cultural divide this created was fascinating and occasionally contentious. American officers educated at West Point and trained in high-tech warfare struggled to accept that barefoot tracking could outperform million-dollar reconnaissance systems. Some dismissed the NZSAS methods as luck or exaggeration. Others, usually those with direct field experience alongside the Kiwis, became converts. They returned to their units advocating for a return to basic fieldcraft skills that had been neglected in favor of technological solutions. The debate raged in professional military journals and training commands. Could primitive methods remain relevant in modern warfare? Or were they merely a historical curiosity kept alive by a small nation with limited resources? Afghanistan answered that question definitively. The NZSAS proved that no amount of technology could replace a trained human who understood terrain, environment, and the enemy's psychology. The primitive tactics were not inferior. They were complementary. The most effective operations combined both approaches. Use drones for initial reconnaissance, then put skilled trackers on the ground to finish the job. Let satellites identify areas of interest, then send operators who could read the land to confirm and exploit. The synthesis of old and new created capabilities that neither could achieve alone. But the real legacy of the NZSAS primitive effectiveness was not tactical. It was cultural. They reminded coalition forces that warfare remained fundamentally a contest of human will. All the technology in the world meant nothing if the soldiers using it lacked the toughness, patience, and skill to operate in the worst conditions imaginable. The Kiwis showed that you could strip away the gadgets, the air conditioning, the creature comforts, and still accomplish the mission if you had hard men with the right mindset. The impact on Australian Special Forces was particularly pronounced. The Australians and New Zealanders had worked together since World War I, and the SASR watched their Kiwi counterparts with professional admiration. Australian operators began adopting some of the NZSAS methods, particularly the emphasis on long-range patrolling with minimal support. The two units became nearly interchangeable in certain mission sets, both drawing on a shared heritage of self-reliance and toughness forged in the unforgiving landscapes of the South Pacific. By 2012, when NZSAS combat operations in Afghanistan began winding down, their reputation within the coalition was secure. They had earned respect, not through size or firepower, but through sheer competence and an unwillingness to quit under any circumstances. The primitive tactics that had initially shocked and confused American allies became a case study in how unconventional thinking could solve problems that technology alone could not. The Kiwis returned home quietly, as was their custom. No parades, no media circus. Just a job completed and brothers brought home alive. But the stories followed them. In special operations communities around the world, veterans swapped tales about the scruffy New Zealanders who could out-track, out-endure, and out-fight anyone. They became a benchmark. If you wanted to test whether your unit was truly hard, you asked if they could operate like the NZSAS. Most could not. The legacy continues today. Training programs across coalition forces now include modules on basic fieldcraft that had been abandoned decades earlier. The pendulum swung back toward fundamentals, because Afghanistan proved that wars are still won by soldiers on the ground who can function when everything else fails. The NZSAS did not discover anything new. They simply refused to forget what their predecessors had learned in jungles and mountains across a century of warfare. They carried those lessons forward and demonstrated that primitive tactics, properly applied, remained as lethal as anything technology could provide. The American lieutenant who had nearly choked on his coffee that first morning at Bagram eventually rotated home. He told anyone who would listen about the New Zealand operators, who looked like homeless veterans, but fought like demons. His friends struggled to believe the stories. Men who refused to shower for weeks, soldiers who preferred duct tape to proper equipment, operators who tracked targets by reading disturbed pebbles. It sounded like fiction, but it was real. Documented in mission reports and corroborated by hundreds of coalition personnel who had witnessed it firsthand. The primitive effectiveness of the NZSAS became part of military folklore. It represented a path not taken by most Western militaries, who had bet everything on technological supremacy. The Kiwis proved that bet was incomplete. Technology amplified capability, but it could not replace the human element. The best soldiers were not those with the fanciest gear. They were the ones who could operate when the gear failed, when resupply was impossible, when conditions became so terrible that lesser troops simply gave up. Afghanistan taught many lessons about modern warfare. Some were about counterinsurgency tactics. Others concerned the limits of air power or the challenges of nation-building. But perhaps the most fundamental lesson came from watching a small group of scruffy New Zealanders accomplish impossible missions using methods that predated radio communication. They showed that war, stripped to its essence, remained a test of will, the side that could endure more, suffer longer, and keep fighting when every rational calculation said to quit was the side that won. No drone could provide that. No satellite could teach it. It had to be forged in the mountains and deserts, through hardship and sacrifice, one brutal mission at a time. The NZSAS understood this at a cellular level. They built their entire culture around it. When coalition forces needed someone to do the impossible, they called the Kiwis. When a mission required 3 weeks in a hide site that would break most soldiers in 3 days, the New Zealanders volunteered. When tracking a target meant wading through filth and disease, they grabbed their rifles and moved out. They never complained. They never quit. They just did the job, got filthy, and went home when it was over. That was the secret to their primitive effectiveness. It was not really primitive at all. It was the distilled essence of what made special operations soldiers effective across every era of warfare. Physical toughness, mental resilience, technical skill, and the absolute refusal to accept defeat regardless of conditions. The NZSAS happened to express those qualities in ways that looked primitive to forces who had forgotten that technology was a tool, not a substitute for warrior spirit. The mountains of Afghanistan, remember. The valleys where Kiwi teams tracked enemies for days without support still bear the faint traces of their passage. The villages where they won hearts and minds through quiet competence rather than loud promises still speak of the New Zealanders with respect. The Taliban fighters who survived encounters with NZSAS patrols remember facing an enemy who seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with devastating precision, and vanish like ghosts. They learned to fear the men who smelled like they had been living in caves, because those were the ones who hunted better than anyone else. Coalition forces learned different lessons. They discovered that their ally from the bottom of the world, a nation with a population smaller than most American cities, produced special operations soldiers who were pound for pound among the finest in the world. They learned that effectiveness in warfare was not measured by budget or technology, but by results. And they learned that sometimes the primitive approach, the one that required nothing but hard men and hard ground, was exactly what the mission demanded. The NZSAS did not set out to terrify American troops or revolutionize coalition tactics. They simply showed up and did what came naturally to them. They refused to shower because it compromised their stealth. They used duct tape and wire because it worked, and they had grown up fixing things that way. They tracked enemies on foot because that was how you hunted deer in the New Zealand high country, and the skills transferred perfectly to hunting humans. They endured appalling conditions because complaining was not part of their culture, and the mission required someone to suffer, so they volunteered. The result was a reputation that outlasted the war itself. Years after the last NZSAS patrol left Afghanistan, their methods continued to influence special operations training and doctrine. Units that had relied exclusively on technology began incorporating fieldcraft back into their programs. Soldiers learned to read tracks, understand terrain, and operate with minimal support. The lessons the Kiwis taught were finally being absorbed, even if it took a decade of war to prove their value. In the end, the primitive tactics were not about rejecting modernity. They were about understanding that modernity rested on foundations that could not be neglected. You could have all the drones and satellites and thermal imaging you wanted, but if your soldiers could not read the ground beneath their feet, you had built a house on sand. The NZSAS knew this instinctively. They honored the old skills while embracing new tools, creating a hybrid approach that maximized both. That was why they terrified allies who had forgotten half the equation. The Kiwis reminded everyone what complete soldiers looked like. And it was a humbling lesson for forces that had grown comfortable behind their technological shields. Afghanistan is quiet now in many of those valleys. The war moved on. New conflicts demand attention, but the legacy of the scruffy men who refused to shower and tracked enemies like animals remains. They proved that some things never change in warfare. Toughness matters, skill matters, brotherhood matters, and sometimes the primitive approach is not primitive at all. It is simply the truth, stripped of everything unnecessary, revealing what actually wins battles when the technology fails and the comfortable assumptions collapse. The NZSAS understood that truth and lived it every day. That was why they succeeded where others struggled, and why their legend grew with every impossible mission they completed, using nothing but boots, rifles, and an unbreakable will.